Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dirt, caked despair and relentless horror of being a peasant during the Black Death. The underfed, overworked backbone of medieval society who gave us plague pits, leech treatments, and the subtle art of coughing once and being immediately written off by your entire village. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you think you'd survive as a peasant during the Black Death? Adorable. Truly, like a kitten trying to outrun a plague cart. So you think you could survive as a peasant during the Black Death? You adorable, delusional creature. You probably can't even handle a Wi-Fi outage without having an existential crisis. But sure, let's pretend you could navigate 14th century Europe while a plague literally nicknamed Death decided to redecorate the continent with corpses. Spoiler alert, you couldn't. You wouldn't last a week. Hell, you probably wouldn't survive the first sneeze you heard echoing across the village square. But let's play this game. Let's imagine you've been transported back to 1347, dropped into the mud, caked, flea-infested, absolutely godforsaken existence of a medieval peasant, just as the most devastating pandemic in human history decides to crash the party. Welcome to your new life, where social distancing means hoping the rats in your hovel don't bite you while you sleep, and hand sanitizer is whatever's left of the holy water after the priest used it to bless 17 corpses that morning. First things first, forget everything you know about hygiene. That's right, toss it all out the window of your imagination, because that window doesn't exist in your new one-room dirt house anyway. You wake up on a straw mattress that's seen more bodily fluids than a medieval battlefield, surrounded by your entire extended family, 3 chickens, a goat that judges you silently, and approximately 4,000 fleas who consider you their personal all-you-can-eat buffet. The smell. Imagine a gym sock filled with rotting fish, set on fire, then doused with the contents of a medieval outhouse. That's your morning aromatherapy. Your daily skincare routine consists of maybe splashing some water on your face if you're feeling fancy, though that water comes from the same well where your neighbours dump their chamber pots and wash their plague-ridden clothes. Soap? What's soap? You've heard merchants talk about something called soap. That comes from far off lands, but you're about as likely to own soap as you are to own a unicorn. Instead, you scrub yourself with sand, hope, and the occasional prayer to Saint Blaise, patron saint of not dying horribly from throat diseases. Your teeth. Let's just say they're more of a suggestion than an actual functional body part. You've been chewing on bread, so hard it could double as building material, and your dental care routine involves picking out the larger chunks of food with whatever sharp stick you can find. Toothpaste is a concept that won't exist for centuries, so you rinse your mouth with wine when you can afford it, or more commonly, just accept that your breath could knock a charging horse unconscious. But here's the thing about the Black Death that really would have ruined your day. It didn't just kill people. It killed people in the most spectacularly horrifying ways imaginable, and then it killed their friends, their families, their livestock, and their dreams of ever seeing another harvest. The plague came in 3 delightful flavors, like death's own twisted ice cream, cart rolling through medieval Europe. First, you had bubonic plague, the classic version. This charming illness announced itself with swellings called buboes that popped up in your armpits, groin, and neck like the world's worst surprise party. These buboes could grow to the size of apples, turn black, and leak pus that smelled like Satan's own armpit. But hey, at least with bubonic plague you had a fighting chance. Maybe 30% of people survived, which in medieval terms was practically a miracle cure. Then there was pneumonic plague, which attacked your lungs with the enthusiasm of a medieval inquisitor. This version spread through the air, which meant every cough, every sneeze, every laboured breath from an infected person was basically a biological weapon. You'd develop a fever, start coughing up blood, and then suffocate on your own fluids while your lungs filled with plague bacteria. The mortality rate, 95%. Those weren't betting odds. Those were Start digging your own grave odds. And finally, septicemic plague, the overachiever of the plague family. This one went straight for your bloodstream, turning your blood into a bacterial soup that poisoned you from the inside out. Your fingers and toes would turn black and fall off. Your skin would develop dark patches that made you look like a walking corpse, and you'd die so quickly that sometimes people just dropped dead in the middle of conversations. Mortality rate nearly 100%. If you caught septicemic plague, you weren't planning for tomorrow, you were hoping to survive until dinner. Now, as a peasant, your understanding of disease came from a medical tradition that thought illness was caused by bad air, angry gods, or having too much blood in your body. The cutting-edge medical advice of the day included things like balance your humours, and maybe try bleeding yourself with leeches. The local barber, surgeon, who was just as likely to cut your hair as amputate your leg, might suggest drilling holes in your skull to let the evil spirits out, or perhaps bathing in urine to ward off the plague. The church, meanwhile, was busy explaining that the Black Death was God's punishment for humanity's sins, which meant the solution was obviously more praying, more fasting, and more self-flagellation. Groups of religious zealots called flagellants wandered from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, because apparently the best response to a plague was to create open wounds that could get infected. Brilliant strategy, medieval Europe. Truly inspired. Your daily routine as a peasant would have been a masterclass in exposure to every possible disease vector. You woke up in a house that was basically a wooden box, filled with animal waste, human waste, rotting food scraps, and enough vermin to staff a medieval horror movie. The floor was dirt, which meant every drop of liquid that ever spilled, every bit of food that ever fell, and every bodily fluid that ever leaked just became part of your living surface. You shared this delightful space with your entire family because privacy was a luxury for rich people. When little Timmy got sick, everyone got sick. When Uncle Herbert started coughing up blood, the whole family got to enjoy the aerosol experience. When Grandmother Martha developed those telltale buboes, well, everyone gathered around to help care for her, because that's what families did, completely unaware that they were basically having a plague-spreading party. Your job, assuming you had one beyond, try not to die today, probably involved farming, which meant you spent your days knee-deep in mud that was equal parts soil, animal manure, and decomposing organic matter. You worked with tools that hadn't been properly cleaned since they were made, handled animals that were just as disease-ridden as you were, and ate food that had been grown in soil fertilized with human waste, because nobody had figured out that maybe, just maybe, there was a connection between eating poop, fertilized vegetables, and getting sick. The animals you worked with were walking disease factories. Your pigs rolled around in mud mixed with their own excrement, and whatever dead things happened to be lying around. Your chickens pecked at anything that looked remotely edible, including other chickens' droppings, rotting scraps, and the occasional plague-killed rat. Your cows grazed in fields where people had been burying plague victims in shallow graves because the graveyards were full and nobody had time for proper burials anymore. And speaking of burials, let's talk about your neighborhood cemetery situation during the Black Death. In normal times, people got nice individual graves, proper funeral services, and time to mourn their dead. During the plague, cemeteries filled up faster than a medieval tavern on payday. Bodies were stacked in mass graves like cordwood, often without coffins, sometimes without even cloth wrappings. The smell of decomposition hung over every town like a blanket of death, and the soil in graveyards became so saturated with decaying human remains that it squelched when you walked on it. But here's the real kicker. You didn't even need to catch the plague to die during the Black Death. The entire social structure of medieval Europe collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Farms were abandoned when entire families died, which meant food shortages. Trade routes shut down when merchants stopped traveling, which meant no imported goods, and no exotic foods, and no news from the outside world. Villages became isolated islands of terror, where survivors huddled together and watched their neighbors die one by one. The economy went to hell faster than a greased pig at a county fair. Money became worthless when there was nothing to buy and nobody alive to sell it. Labour shortages meant that essential services just stopped happening. No one was maintaining the roads, so travel became even more dangerous. No one was maintaining the mills, so grain couldn't be processed into flour. No one was maintaining the bridges, so rivers became uncrossable barriers. Your local lord, who under normal circumstances would have provided some semblance of protection and organisation, was probably either dead, dying, or had fled to his country estate to wait out the plague in luxury. The feudal system that had held medieval society together for centuries just evaporated like morning dew when half the population turned into corpses. Law and order. What law and order? The local sheriff was dead. The judge was dead. Half the jury was dead, and the other half was too busy dying to show up for court. Crime became essentially legal, because there was nobody left to enforce the law and nowhere to put criminals even if you caught them. Bandits roamed the countryside, robbing travellers and raiding abandoned villages, because why not? The apocalypse was apparently a great time to take up highway robbery as a career. Religious institutions, which had been the backbone of medieval society, crumbled like stale bread. Priests died at an alarming rate because they kept administering last rites to plague victims, which involved getting very close to very sick people and handling their contaminated belongings. Monasteries that had existed for centuries simply emptied out as monks died faster than they could be replaced. The Pope himself fled Rome and holed up in Avignon, which sent a pretty clear message about how confident the Church was in its ability to pray the plague away. But let's get back to your personal experience of trying not to die horribly. Your daily routine would have been a constant dance with death, like playing Russian roulette with a gun that had 5 bullets and 1 empty chamber. You woke up each morning and performed a mental inventory. Do I feel feverish? Are there any strange swellings on my body? Is that cough just from the smoky air in my house, or am I about to start spitting up blood? Your breakfast, assuming you had one, consisted of whatever hadn't rotted overnight in your food stores. Bread that was so hard you could use it as a weapon. Porridge made from grain that might have been contaminated with ergot fungus, which would give you hallucinations and gangrene as a fun bonus. And Arla wine because water was essentially a death sentence in liquid form. You drank alcohol not because you were an alcoholic, but because fermented beverages were the only liquids that wouldn't immediately give you dysentery. Getting dressed was an adventure in itself. Your clothes were made of wool or linen that had been worn by at least 3 previous owners, all of whom might have died of plague. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of washing their clothes frequently, so your outfit was basically a wearable petri dish of medieval bacteria, medieval sweat, and medieval despair. Your shoes, if you had them, were made of leather that had been cured using urine and animal brains, then sewn together with thread made from animal sinews. Fashion was not a consideration, keeping your feet from rotting off was. Leaving your house meant entering a world that looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic horror movie. Streets were littered with bodies, because there weren't enough living people to collect them all. Dogs and rats feasted on corpses in broad daylight, then wandered through the markets and into people's homes, spreading plague bacteria like they were handing out business cards for death. The smell was indescribable. Imagine the worst odor you've ever encountered, then multiply it by 1,000 and set it on fire. The combination of human decomposition, animal waste, rotting food, and general medieval filth created an aromatic experience that would make a modern sewage treatment plant smell like a rose garden by comparison. People tried to ward off the bad air by carrying bouquets of herbs or wearing cloth masks soaked in vinegar, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with an umbrella. Your social interactions during the Black Death would have been exercises in paranoia and terror. Every person you met was a potential carrier of death. That friendly neighbour who waved at you yesterday, he might be in the early stages of plague infection, cheerfully spreading bacteria with every breath. The merchant who sold you grain last week, he might have handled contaminated goods from a plague-ridden city, turning his entire cart into a mobile death dispenser. People became suspicious of strangers, of travellers, of anyone who looked even slightly unwell. Towns started closing their gates to outsiders, but it was too late. The plague had already spread everywhere, carried by the very trade networks that had made medieval Europe prosperous. Merchants who had once been welcomed as bringers of exotic goods and news from distant lands were now viewed as harbingers of death. Family relationships became complicated when love and survival instincts clashed. Do you care for your plague-stricken child and risk catching the disease yourself? Or do you abandon them to save your own life? Do you stay with your dying spouse until the end? Or do you flee to protect yourself and your other children? These weren't theoretical ethical dilemmas. These were daily decisions that determined who lived and who died. Many families simply disintegrated. Children were abandoned when their parents died. Elderly relatives were left to fend for themselves when their adult children succumbed to plague. Husbands fled from wives, wives fled from husbands, and siblings scattered to the winds, each hoping to outrun a disease that travelled faster than they could walk. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical disease. Imagine living in constant fear, not just of death, but of a particularly horrible death that might come without warning. You went to sleep each night wondering if you would wake up with buboes, or if you would wake up at all. You looked at your children and wondered which one would die first. You made plans for tomorrow while simultaneously expecting to be dead by evening. Depression and anxiety weren't medical conditions in the 14th century. They were just normal responses to living through the apocalypse. People developed what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, but medieval medicine attributed mental distress to demonic possession or an imbalance of bodily humors. The treatment for psychological trauma was often more traumatic than the original problem: exorcism, bloodletting, or being locked up with other, mad, people in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon look comfortable. Some people responded to the constant threat of death by embracing hedonism. If you're going to die anyway, why not eat, drink, and be merry while you can? Towns that hadn't been completely depopulated often saw wild parties where people spent their life savings on wine and food, had public orgies, and generally behaved like the world was ending, because from their perspective it was. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming extremely religious and ascetic. They joined flagellant groups, spent their days in prayer and self-mortification, and believed that by punishing themselves enough, they could appease God's wrath and stop the plague. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The flagellants died just as quickly as everyone else. They just died with more self-inflicted wounds. Your work life during the Black Death would have been surreal. If you were a farmer, you might have been the only person left to tend fields that had previously employed dozens of workers. You'd be responsible for crops you didn't know how to grow, using tools you didn't know how to maintain, trying to feed a community that was shrinking by the day. Many farmers simply abandoned their fields and let crops rot in the ground, because there was no point in harvesting food for people who would be dead before winter. If you were a craftsperson, your customers were dying faster than you could complete their orders. Carpenters found themselves building coffins exclusively when they could get wood, and when there was anyone left to bury. Blacksmiths forged weapons for people who would never live to use them. Weavers made cloth for markets that no longer existed. The most thriving profession during the Black Death was probably grave digging, and even that was overwhelmed by demand. Professional grave diggers died so frequently that communities had to press anyone with a shovel into service. Bodies were buried in layers, like medieval lasagna, with lime scattered between the levels to try to control the smell and slow decomposition. Your education during this period would have consisted mainly of learning new ways to die. You'd become an expert in reading the early signs of plague infection. Not because anyone taught you, but because you watched hundreds of people go through the same progression from health to horrific death. You'd learn to recognize the smell of gangrenous flesh, the sound of plague-induced coughing, and the particular way people walked when they were trying to hide buboes under their arms. You'd also become surprisingly knowledgeable about corpse disposal, food preservation during social collapse, and the fine art of avoiding human contact while still managing to stay alive. These weren't skills anyone planned to learn, but they were essential for survival in a world where the normal social contract had been dissolved by mass death. The children who survived the Black Death grew up with a fundamentally different understanding of life than previous generations. They'd seen their parents die, their siblings die, their friends die, and they'd learned that adults couldn't protect them from anything that really mattered. They developed a kind of premature wisdom about mortality that was both impressive and heartbreaking. These children often became feral, living in packs in abandoned buildings, stealing food from empty houses, and taking care of each other because there were no adults left to do it. They created their own social structures, their own rules, and their own ways of surviving in a world that had forgotten how to care for its young. Your romantic life during the Black Death would have been complicated by the constant possibility that anyone you fell in love with might be dead within a week. Courtship became abbreviated out of necessity. People married quickly, not because they were impulsive, but because waiting for a long engagement meant risking the possibility that one or both partners would die before the wedding. Many marriages during this period were essentially business arrangements for survival. Two people would combine their resources, their skills, and their luck, in hopes that together they might have a better chance of surviving than they would alone. Romance was a luxury for people who weren't constantly worried about dying horribly. Sex during the Black Death was complicated by the knowledge that physical intimacy increased the risk of disease transmission. People had to weigh their desire for human connection against their instinct for self-preservation. Some couples stayed together until death, literally, sharing their final weeks or days in a kind of romantic martyrdom. Others separated at the first sign of illness, choosing survival over love. Pregnancy during the plague was basically a death sentence with extra steps. Pregnant women were more susceptible to disease, had less mobility to escape infected areas, and required more resources at a time when resources were scarce. Many pregnant women died before giving birth. Many others died in childbirth because there were no midwives left alive, no clean facilities, and no medical knowledge beyond pray and hope for the best. The babies who were born during the Black Death often didn't survive their first year, not necessarily from plague, but from malnutrition, exposure, and the general collapse of everything that normally kept infants alive. Breast milk was often contaminated with disease, baby formula didn't exist, and clean water was harder to find than unicorns. Your spiritual life during the Black Death would have been a constant crisis of faith. The medieval world was built on the assumption that God was in control, that suffering had meaning, and that good people were rewarded while evil people were punished. The Black Death destroyed all of those comforting beliefs with the efficiency of a medieval siege engine. Good people died just as horribly as bad people. Innocent children suffered just as much as adult sinners. Priests and nuns, who were supposedly closest to God, died at higher rates than ordinary people because they insisted on providing comfort to the dying. If God was in control, then either God was malevolent or God wasn't actually in control. Neither option was particularly comforting. Some people lost their faith entirely, deciding that if God existed at all, he was either powerless or evil. Others doubled down on religious belief, convincing themselves that the plague was a test of faith that they had to pass to earn eternal salvation. Still others developed new, stranger religious ideas, mixing Christianity with folk magic, paganism, and pure desperation. The church's official response to the crisis was largely useless. Church leaders blamed the plague on human sinfulness, which meant the solution was more prayer, more fasting, and more giving money to the church. When that didn't work, they blamed it on Jews, Muslims, and other convenient scapegoats, which led to pogroms and massacres that killed thousands of people who had nothing to do with the plague. Some church officials tried to provide practical help, organizing food distribution, caring for orphans, and maintaining some semblance of social order. These efforts were heroic but ultimately inadequate. The plague was simply too large, too fast, and too deadly for medieval institutions to handle. Your diet during the Black Death would have been whatever you could find that hadn't rotted, hadn't been contaminated by plague victims, and hadn't been eaten by rats. Food preservation techniques that had worked for centuries suddenly became inadequate when half the people who knew how to use them were dead. Grain stored in communal granaries was often contaminated by rats, who spread plague bacteria throughout the food supply. Meat from animals that had died of disease which was most animals during the plague years, was still eaten because people were desperate, even though it often made them sicker. Fish from rivers and ponds were unsafe because the water sources had been contaminated by human and animal corpses. Many people survived on foraged foods, nuts, berries, roots, and anything else they could find growing wild. But even foraging became dangerous because you might encounter infected animals or find food growing near plague burial sites. The safest foods were often the least nutritious, which meant that even people who avoided the plague often died of malnutrition. Cooking became an art form of creative desperation. People learned to make soup from tree bark, bread from acorns, and beer from whatever fermentable plant matter they could find. Recipes from this period read like survival manuals rather than cookbooks, with instructions for extracting nutrients from materials that wouldn't normally be considered food. The spice trade, which had been one of the driving forces of medieval commerce, essentially stopped during the plague years. Spices didn't just make food taste better, they helped preserve it and mask the flavor of meat that was starting to spoil. Without spices, people had to eat bland, often partially rotten food, which led to digestive problems that further weakened their immune systems. Your housing situation during the Black Death would have been a constant balance between seeking shelter and avoiding infected spaces. Houses where plague victims had died were abandoned, but they often contained valuable supplies that desperate survivors needed. Do you risk entering an infected house to look for food, blankets, or tools? Or do you stay away and risk dying from exposure or starvation? Many survivors moved frequently, abandoning houses at the first sign of plague infection and looking for new places to live. This constant movement spread the disease even further, as infected people carried plague bacteria to previously unaffected areas. Building maintenance became impossible when most of the craftspeople were dead. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled, and floors rotted, but there was nobody left to fix them. People lived in increasingly degraded conditions, which created perfect environments for disease transmission. The concept of home became fluid during the plague years. Your home might be whatever building you'd slept in last night, or whatever cave or abandoned structure offered temporary shelter from the elements. Long-term planning became meaningless when you couldn't be sure you'd be alive next week. Heating became a critical survival issue as social structures collapsed. Firewood was often scarce because the people who normally cut and transported it were dead. Coal was expensive and hard to find. Many people burned furniture, books, and even wooden parts of their houses to stay warm, gradually destroying their own shelters in order to survive another day. Your transportation during the Black Death would have been primarily on foot, because horses were expensive, required care and feeding, and often died of disease just like humans. Walking was dangerous because it exposed you to other travelers who might be infected, but staying in one place was also dangerous because plague could arrive in your town at any time. Roads became increasingly dangerous as law enforcement collapsed. Bandits preyed on travelers, but they also served an unintentional public health function by discouraging unnecessary travel, which helped slow the spread of disease. Being robbed was terrible, but it was better than catching the plague from an infected merchant. Rivers and waterways, which had been major transportation routes, became contaminated with corpses. Bodies thrown into rivers floated downstream and contaminated water supplies in communities that hadn't even seen plague victims yet. Water travel became almost as dangerous as land travel, but for different reasons. Weather during the plague years seemed particularly harsh, though this might have been because people were less able to cope with normal weather variations. Storms that would have been minor inconveniences in normal times became life-threatening emergencies when there was no community support system to help with recovery. Winters were especially brutal because fuel was scarce, food was scarce, and warm clothing was often contaminated with plague bacteria from previous owners. Many people who survived the plague during summer and fall died of exposure during their first plague-era winter. Your entertainment during the Black Death would have been whatever brief moments of joy you could find between bouts of terror and despair. Music continued, but songs became darker, focusing on themes of death, judgment, and the afterlife. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic theme, showing skeletons dancing with people from all walks of life, as a reminder that death comes for everyone. Storytelling took on new importance as people tried to make sense of their experiences and preserve memories of the dead. But stories also became vehicles for spreading useful survival information, which areas to avoid, which symptoms to watch for, which treatments might actually help. Games and sports continued, but they often had a morbid twist. Children played games that involved pretending to be plague doctors or acting out funeral scenes. Adults gambled more heavily, partly because money was becoming worthless anyway, and partly because taking risks felt normal when your entire existence was one big risk. Art during this period was dominated by religious themes, particularly depictions of death, judgment, and the afterlife. People commissioned paintings and sculptures not for beauty, but as prayers made visible, hoping that artistic piety might protect them from disease. Books became precious during the plague, not just for their content, but as physical objects. Libraries were abandoned when their caretakers died, and many books were lost to neglect, theft, or being used as fuel for fires. The ones that survived often contained marginal notes from plague survivors, creating inadvertent historical records of personal experiences during the pandemic. Your concept of time during the Black Death would have been fundamentally different from normal medieval life. Instead of planning for seasons, harvests, and religious holidays, you'd be thinking in terms of how long since the last plague case in our village, and how long can we survive on current food supplies. The normal rhythms of medieval life were disrupted. Religious festivals were cancelled when too many people were sick to attend. Market days were suspended when merchants stopped travelling. Seasonal work patterns meant nothing when there weren't enough people left to do the work. People developed a kind of hypervigilance about time, constantly monitoring their own health and the health of others for signs of disease progression. The time between first symptoms and death became a crucial calculation that determined whether someone had time to settle their affairs, say goodbye to family, or receive last rites. The future became an abstract concept. People stopped making long-term plans because long-term survival was so uncertain. Marriage contracts specified what would happen if one or both parties died of plague. Business agreements included clauses about plague-related disruptions. Wills were written and rewritten constantly as family members died and new heirs had to be designated. Your relationship with money during the Black Death would have been complicated by the fact that traditional currency became almost meaningless. Gold and silver were still valuable in theory, but you couldn't eat them, and they didn't protect you from disease. What good was money when there was nothing to buy and nobody alive to sell it? Barter systems became more common as people traded goods and services directly. A loaf of bread might be worth a pair of shoes, or an hour of labor might be worth a cup of ale. The relative value of different items shifted dramatically based on immediate survival needs. Some goods became incredibly valuable: clean water, preserved food, warm clothing, and anything that might provide protection from disease. Other items that had been expensive before the plague became worthless: jewelry, decorative objects, and luxury goods that served no practical survival purpose. People hoarded essentials when they could find them, but hoarding was also dangerous because it made you a target for desperate neighbors or passing bandits. The optimal strategy was to have enough supplies to survive, but not so much that others would kill you for them. Debts became uncollectible when creditors and debtors died in equal numbers. Property ownership became meaningless when there was nobody left to enforce property rights. The entire economic system that had taken centuries to develop simply evaporated in a few years of mass death. Your understanding of geography during the Black Death would have been shaped by the movement of disease rather than normal political or cultural boundaries. Towns were classified as infected, probably infected, or not yet infected. Travel routes were evaluated based on plague risk rather than convenience or commerce. Maps, if you had access to them, would have been marked with information about plague outbreaks rather than traditional features. Here there be dragons would have been replaced with here there be plague victims. Entire regions became no-go zones where travelers entered at their own risk and often didn't come back out. The concept of safe places became fluid and temporary. A town that was plague-free one week might be decimated the next. People developed mental maps of epidemic patterns, trying to predict where the disease would spread next and where they might find temporary refuge. Distance became measured in survival time rather than miles. A journey that normally took 3 days might take a week if you had to detour around infected areas, stop frequently to avoid contact with other travelers, and spend extra time searching for safe food and water. International awareness became focused on plague progression. News from other countries wasn't about politics or trade. It was about whether the plague had reached them yet, how many had died, and whether they'd found any effective treatments or preventive measures. Your sleep during the Black Death would have been fitful and interrupted by constant anxiety. Every sound in the night might be someone approaching your house, either seeking help or bringing disease. Every ache or pain when you woke up might be the beginning of plague symptoms. Dreams during this period were often nightmares filled with images of death, disease, and abandonment. People reported dreams where they were chased by skeleton figures, where they watched their families die repeatedly, or where they found themselves alone in empty cities filled with corpses. Insomnia became common as people's minds raced with survival concerns. Should we flee our current location? Do we have enough food stored? Is that cough I heard from the next room the beginning of plague symptoms? The mental load of constant survival planning made restful sleep almost impossible. People developed rituals around bedtime that were designed to provide comfort and a sense of control. Prayers became longer and more desperate. People checked and rechecked their food supplies, their escape routes, and their family members' health status before trying to sleep. The boundary between sleep and waking became blurred for many plague survivors, who existed in a state of exhausted hypervigilance that made them feel like they were never fully asleep and never fully awake. Your concept of cleanliness during the Black Death would have been primitive by modern standards. But people did develop new hygiene practices in response to the plague, even if they didn't understand the scientific reasons behind them. Some communities started burning the belongings of plague victims, which actually was effective at destroying contaminated materials. Personal washing became more frequent among those who could afford it, not because people understood germ theory, but because they'd noticed that cleaner people seemed to survive longer. This observation was partly correct, though for reasons they couldn't have understood. Clothing was fumigated with smoke, herbs, and vinegar in attempts to ward off plague. These practices were only marginally effective, but they represented an early understanding that disease might be connected to contaminated materials. People started avoiding crowded places, not because they understood airborne transmission, but because they'd observed that plague spread faster in crowded conditions. Markets, churches, and festivals were avoided by anyone who had a choice in the matter. Hand washing became more common, though people thought they were washing away bad air rather than bacteria. Soap was still rare and expensive, but people used sand, ashes, and other abrasive materials to scrub their hands more frequently. Your social life during the Black Death would have been severely restricted by the need to avoid contact with potentially infected people. Gatherings of any kind became risky, which meant that most of the social activities that made medieval life bearable simply stopped happening. Conversation became focused on survival topics, where to find food, which areas to avoid, who had died recently, and what treatments people had tried. Social chit-chat about weather, gossip, and local politics seemed frivolous when everyone was focused on staying alive. Friendship took on new meaning, when being a good friend might mean risking your life to help someone, or might mean staying away from them to avoid catching their disease. People had to choose between loyalty and survival, and different people made different choices. Community cooperation became essential for survival, but it also became dangerous. Working together to harvest crops or defend against bandits required close contact that could spread disease. Communities had to balance the benefits of cooperation against the risks of disease transmission. Social hierarchies began to break down as traditional authorities died and survivors had to create new forms of organization. Peasants might find themselves in leadership roles simply because they were among the few people left alive who knew how to organize essential activities. Your daily routine during the Black Death would have been structured around survival tasks rather than normal work schedules. The first priority each morning was checking everyone's health status. Did anyone develop symptoms overnight? Was anyone showing signs of fever or swelling? Food preparation took much longer because everything had to be inspected for contamination, and sources of food were often unreliable. You might spend half the day searching for safe food and clean water, tasks that had been simple before the plague. Security became a daily concern as law enforcement collapsed. You'd need to check your doors and windows, hide your valuable supplies, and plan escape routes in case bandits or desperate neighbors decided to raid your home. Communication with the outside world required careful planning. Should someone risk going to the market for news and supplies? Which family member was most likely to survive an encounter with infected people? How could you get information about plague progression without exposing yourself to disease? Evening routines focused on planning for the next day and the possibility that it might be your last. People wrote letters they might never send, said prayers they hoped someone would hear, and made contingency plans for what should happen if they died during the night. Your medical knowledge during the Black Death would have been a mixture of traditional folk remedies, religious practices, and desperate experimentation. People tried everything they could think of to prevent or treat plague, from wearing amulets made of supposedly protective stones to drinking concoctions that would make a modern poison control center weep with despair. The medical establishment, such as it was, recommended treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting was still considered a cure, all because medieval doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. So when people developed plague symptoms, doctors would drain their blood, weakening them further and making them more likely to die. It was like treating a house fire by removing the smoke detectors. Popular remedies included drinking ground unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk and did absolutely nothing, wearing pouches of herbs around your neck, marginally useful as deodorant, useless against plague, and bathing in the urine of young boys. Don't ask me to explain this one, because I can't. People also tried eating crushed emeralds, which was expensive, painful, and about as effective as you'd expect eating rocks to be. Some communities developed quarantine practices, though they didn't understand the scientific principles behind them. They just noticed that isolating sick people seemed to slow the spread of disease. Unfortunately, medieval quarantine often meant locking infected people in their houses and leaving them to die alone, which was effective at containing disease, but absolutely horrific from a humanitarian perspective. The concept of contagion existed, but it was poorly understood. People knew that plague seemed to spread from person to person, but they thought it was transmitted through bad air or aval vapors, rather than through actual physical contact with infected bodily fluids. This led to practices like burning aromatic woods and herbs to purify the air, which made things smell better, but didn't actually prevent disease transmission. Your relationship with death during the Black Death would have been completely transformed from normal medieval attitudes. In ordinary times, death was a solemn, ritualized process. People died surrounded by family, received last rites from a priest, and were buried with proper ceremony in consecrated ground. The Black Death made all of that impossible. Death became casual, anonymous, and utterly commonplace. People died alone because their families were afraid to approach them. They died without last rites because the priests were all dead. They were buried in mass graves without ceremony because there wasn't time for individual funerals and there weren't enough people left to dig individual graves. You would have become desensitized to death in ways that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Seeing corpses in the street became as normal as seeing stray dogs. Stepping over dead bodies to go about your daily business became just another part of urban navigation. The smell of human decomposition became background scent, like the smell of bread baking or horses in the street had been in normal times. Children who grew up during the plague developed a relationship with death that was fundamentally different from previous generations. They played games involving death and disease because those were the dominant themes of their daily experience. They drew pictures of skeletons and plague victims because that's what they saw around them. They learned to evaluate adults based on how likely they were to survive rather than how much they liked them. Your concept of the afterlife during the Black Death would have been shaped by the sheer volume of people dying and the apparent randomness of who lived and who died. Traditional Christian teaching said that good people went to heaven and bad people went to hell, but the plague killed saints and sinners with equal enthusiasm. Some people decided that the plague was the beginning of the end times, the apocalypse described in the book of Revelation. They looked for signs and portents that would confirm that Christ was about to return and judge the living and the dead. Every unusual weather event, every strange animal behavior, every particularly horrific plague death was interpreted as evidence that the world was ending. Others lost faith in the afterlife entirely, deciding that if there was any justice in the universe, it certainly wasn't being administered by a loving God. These people embraced a kind of nihilistic hedonism, figuring that if this life was all there was, they might as well enjoy it while they could. Still others developed new, syncretic religious beliefs that combined Christian theology with older pagan practices, folk magic, and pure desperation. They prayed to saints and demons with equal fervor, wore Christian crosses alongside pagan amulets, and practiced rituals that would have horrified church authorities in normal times. Your work life during the Black Death would have been surreal in ways that would make modern workplace dysfunction seem quaint by comparison. Traditional job categories became meaningless when most of the people who knew how to do specific jobs were dead. A peasant farmer might find himself trying to practice medicine, not because he had any medical training, but because he was the only person left in the village who could read the single medical text that had survived the plague. Apprenticeship systems that had taken generations to develop simply collapsed overnight. Master craftsmen died before they could train their apprentices, taking specialized knowledge with them to the grave. Apprentices found themselves trying to practice trades they'd barely learned, using tools they didn't fully understand, serving customers who might die before paying for their work. The concept of career advancement became laughably irrelevant. Instead of working your way up through guild hierarchies over decades, you might find yourself in a position of responsibility simply because everyone above you in the organizational chart had died. Medieval Europe experienced the ultimate flat organizational structure, except instead of being created by progressive management theory, it was created by mass death. Payment for work became complicated when traditional currency lost much of its value, and when the people who owed you money kept dying before they could pay you. Many workers shifted to a barter system, accepting payment in food, clothing, tools, or other practical goods, rather than coins that might not be worth anything next week. Job security, which had never been great for medieval peasants, became completely non-existent. You might have steady work one day, and find yourself unemployed the next when your employer died of plague. On the other hand, certain jobs became incredibly secure simply because the people who knew how to do them were so rare. If you were one of the few surviving millers in your region, you could basically name your price for grinding grain. Your education during the Black Death would have been primarily practical rather than theoretical. You'd learn essential survival skills like how to identify safe food, how to avoid obviously infected people, how to purify water, and how to treat minor injuries when there were no doctors available. Literacy became more valuable and more rare simultaneously. Books were precious because so many had been lost when their owners died. But the ability to read them was precious because so many literate people had died. If you could read, you might find yourself in demand to interpret medical texts, legal documents, or religious materials for communities that had lost their educated classes. Mathematics became focused on practical survival calculations. How long will our food supplies last? How many people can we feed with current resources? What's the mortality rate in our community compared to neighboring areas? These weren't academic exercises, they were life and death planning tools. Geography education consisted mainly of learning which areas were infected, which routes were safe for travel, and where resources might be available. People developed detailed mental maps of plague progression that were more accurate and more useful than any official maps of the time. History education became oral tradition passed down by by plague survivors who had witnessed the collapse of the old world and were trying to preserve knowledge for whatever world would emerge from the ashes. These weren't formal lessons. They were stories told around fires by people who had seen civilization crumble and were trying to make sure future generations would know what had been lost. Your relationship with animals during the Black Death would have been complicated by the fact that many animals were also affected by plague, though in different ways than humans. Rats, of course, were the primary carriers of the fleas that spread bubonic plague, though people at the time didn't understand this connection. Domestic animals became both more valuable and more dangerous. A healthy cow or pig was incredibly precious because it represented a renewable source of food, but it was also a potential disease vector that could spread infection throughout your household. People had to balance their need for animal products against the risk of disease transmission. Cats were particularly valued during the plague because they killed rats, though people didn't understand the scientific reason why this was helpful. They just noticed that areas with more cats seemed to have less plague, so cats became highly prized and were often stolen from their owners. Dogs often became feral during the plague as their human families died, and there was nobody left to care for them. Packs of wild dogs roamed through abandoned towns, scavenging on human corpses and occasionally attacking living people who were too weak to defend themselves. Horses became both transportation and food. A living horse was incredibly valuable for travel and for pulling plows, but a dead horse was also valuable as meat when other food sources were unavailable. People had to make difficult decisions about whether to eat their transportation or risk starvation while maintaining their mobility. Wild animals often moved into abandoned human settlements, creating surreal scenes where deer grazed in empty marketplaces and wolves denned in abandoned houses. Nature began to reclaim human spaces with startling speed when there weren't enough people left to maintain the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. Your relationship with the weather during the Black Death would have been more intense than normal, because you had fewer resources to protect yourself from environmental extremes. A rainstorm that would have been a minor inconvenience in normal times could become life-threatening when you didn't have adequate shelter or dry clothing. Seasonal changes affected plague transmission in ways that people noticed but didn't understand. The disease seemed to spread more slowly in winter, when cold weather kept people indoors and reduced contact between communities. Summer brought renewed outbreaks as trade and travel resumed. People developed superstitions about weather patterns and plague outbreaks, looking for correlations that might help them predict when and where the disease would strike next. Unusual weather events were often interpreted as omens of approaching plague outbreaks. Climate during the plague years seemed harsher than normal, though this perception was probably influenced by people's reduced ability to cope with ordinary weather variations. When you're malnourished, sick, and psychologically traumatized, normal weather feels more extreme. Farmers who survived had to adjust to weather patterns without the accumulated wisdom of older generations who had died. Traditional knowledge about when to plant, when to harvest, and how to prepare for seasonal changes was lost along with the people who possessed it. Your concept of privacy during the Black Death would have been almost non-existent. When survival depended on community cooperation, individual privacy became a luxury that few could afford. People lived in close quarters, shared resources, and monitored each other's health constantly. Personal secrets became harder to keep when communities were small and everyone knew everyone else's business intimately. If you had food stored away, your neighbors would know. If you were showing early symptoms of plague, someone would notice. If you were planning to flee the area, word would spread quickly. The privacy of death, which had been important in medieval culture, became impossible when people died in such large numbers. Bodies were handled by strangers, buried without individual ceremonies, and mourned collectively rather than individually. Sexual privacy disappeared when families were crowded into single rooms, and when survival often depended on forming new relationships quickly. Courtship became abbreviated and public, and marriage became a practical survival strategy rather than a private romantic choice. Mental privacy became almost impossible when psychological trauma was universal, and when survival often required sharing your fears, plans, and resources with others. The luxury of keeping your thoughts to yourself was replaced by the necessity of constant communication about survival strategies. Your sense of personal identity during the Black Death would have been severely challenged by the collapse of all the social structures that normally defined who you were. Your job, your family relationships, your social position, your community role, and your future plans all became meaningless when the social order disintegrated. People were forced to reinvent themselves constantly as circumstances changed. A nobleman might become a beggar when his estate was abandoned. A peasant might become a leader when everyone with traditional authority died. A child might become an adult when their parents died and left them responsible for younger siblings. Names became less important when so many people died that keeping track of individual identities became impossible. People were identified by their survival skills, their remaining family connections, or their roles in whatever new social structures emerged from the chaos. Personal possessions, which had been important markers of identity in medieval society, became either incredibly precious, if they were useful for survival, or completely worthless, if they were purely decorative. A beautiful tapestry that had been a family treasure for generations might be traded for a loaf of bread, or used as a blanket. The stories people told about themselves had to be constantly revised as their old lives became irrelevant and new survival strategies became necessary. I used to be a merchant. Mattered less than, I know where to find clean water, or I can identify edible plants. Your understanding of technology during the Black Death would have been focused on the practical tool and techniques needed for survival rather than the sophisticated crafts and trades that had characterized normal medieval life. Complex technologies that required specialized knowledge and materials became unavailable when the people who understood them died. Simple tools became incredibly valuable: knives for cutting and defense, pots for cooking and water storage, needles for mending clothes, and basic carpentry tools for maintaining shelter. People learned to make do with crude, improvised tools when proper equipment wasn't available. Medical technology regressed to the most basic level as trained physicians died and sophisticated treatments became unavailable. People relied on folk remedies, herbal treatments, and basic wound care using whatever materials they could find. Agricultural technology simplified dramatically as complex farming techniques were forgotten and as there weren't enough people left to maintain sophisticated irrigation systems, crop rotation schedules, or selective breeding programs for livestock. Communication technology became focused on survival rather than commerce or culture. Messages were about plague outbreaks, available resources, and safety information rather than business transactions or social news. Manufacturing technology collapsed as guilds dissolved and as the apprenticeship systems that transmitted technical knowledge were disrupted. People learned to make crude versions of essential items rather than the sophisticated products that had been available before the plague. Your relationship with time during the Black Death would have been fundamentally altered by the constant presence of death and the collapse of normal social rhythms. Instead of thinking in terms of seasons, years, and generations, you'd be thinking in terms of days survived, weeks since the last plague outbreak, and months until your food supplies ran out. The future became almost unimaginable beyond the immediate short term. People stopped making long-term plans because long-term survival was so uncertain. Marriage contracts, business agreements, and apprenticeship arrangements all had to be written with the assumption that one or more parties might die before the agreements could be fulfilled. The past became both more precious and more painful as people realized that the world they had known was gone forever. Memories of normal life became treasured, but also torturous reminders of everything that had been lost. The present became hyper-intense as people focused all their attention on immediate survival needs. Every decision had to be evaluated in terms of short-term survival rather than long-term consequences. Should you eat your stored food now or save it for later? Should you help a sick neighbor or avoid them to protect yourself? Religious time, which had structured medieval life around saints' days, holy seasons, and religious observances, became disrupted when churches closed, priests died, and religious festivals were cancelled. People lost their familiar temporal landmarks, and had to create new ways of marking the passage of time. Work time became irregular and unpredictable as traditional job schedules collapsed and as survival tasks took priority over regular employment. People worked when work was available and rested when they could, rather than following the structured routines that had characterized normal medieval life. Your concept of law and justice during the Black Death would have been shaped by the collapse of legal institutions and the need to create new forms of social organization from scratch. Traditional legal authorities died along with everyone else, leaving communities without established ways to resolve disputes or punish crimes. Vigilante justice became common as communities took law enforcement into their own hands. People formed informal groups to protect their resources, maintain order, and deal with troublemakers using whatever methods seemed necessary for survival. Property rights became fluid when original owners died and when survival needs took priority over legal niceties. Abandoned houses were occupied by whoever needed shelter. Unused fields were farmed by whoever could work them. Ownerless livestock were claimed by whoever could care for them. Criminal behavior was often motivated by desperation rather than greed, which complicated traditional ideas about guilt and punishment. Was it really theft when someone stole food to feed their starving children? Was it murder when someone killed an infected person to protect their community from plague? New forms of community governance emerged based on survival needs rather than traditional hierarchies. Decisions were made by whoever was present and capable rather than by people with official authority. Leadership went to people who could organize essential activities rather than people with hereditary titles or legal training. Punishment became focused on community protection rather than abstract justice. People who threatened community survival were exiled or executed, not because they had violated legal codes, but because they endangered everyone else's chances of staying alive. Your understanding of economics during the Black Death would have been revolutionized by the collapse of normal market systems and the emergence of survival-based exchange networks. Traditional concepts of value became meaningless when survival needs took priority over abstract wealth. Currency became less important than practical goods. Gold and silver were still theoretically valuable, but you couldn't eat them, wear them for warmth, or use them to defend yourself. A sharp knife might be worth more than a gold coin, and a healthy pig might be worth more than a chest of silver. Trade relationships became more personal and immediate. Instead of complex commercial networks involving multiple intermediaries, people traded directly with their neighbors for goods they needed right away. I'll give you this loaf of bread for that pair of shoes. Replaced elaborate credit arrangements and long-distance commerce. Labor became incredibly valuable and incredibly risky simultaneously. People with essential skills could demand high compensation, but they also risked exposure to disease when they provided services to others. A surviving doctor or miller could become wealthy, but they might not live long enough to enjoy their wealth. Supply and demand took on new meanings when supply chains collapsed and when demand was focused on immediate survival needs. Items that had been common became precious when production stopped. Items that had been luxury goods became worthless when nobody had the resources to buy them. Investment and savings became meaningless concepts when the future was so uncertain. People stopped accumulating wealth for long-term security and instead focused on acquiring whatever they needed to survive the next few days or weeks. Your social relationships during the Black Death would have been simultaneously more important and more dangerous than ever before. Human connections became essential for survival, but they also increased your risk of disease transmission. Friendships were tested by impossible choices between loyalty and self-preservation. Do you help a friend who has developed plague symptoms, knowing that you might catch the disease yourself? Do you share your food with hungry neighbors when you're not sure you have enough for your own family? Family relationships became complicated when traditional roles and hierarchies collapsed. Children might find themselves caring for sick parents. Wives might become widows who had to support themselves and their children without male protection. Extended families might be scattered by death and displacement. Marriage during the plague often became a practical survival strategy rather than a romantic choice. People married quickly to combine resources, share labor, and provide mutual protection. Love was a luxury that many people couldn't afford when survival was the primary concern. Community relationships had to be rebuilt from scratch as traditional social structures collapsed. New forms of cooperation emerged based on practical needs rather than traditional obligations. People worked together not because custom demanded it, but because cooperation improved everyone's chances of survival. Trust became both more important and more difficult to maintain. You needed to trust others in order to cooperate for mutual survival, but you also had to be suspicious of everyone as potential disease carriers. People developed complex systems of social interaction that balanced cooperation with caution. Your daily emotional experience during the Black Death would have been dominated by fear, grief, and a desperate determination to survive another day. Fear was constant and multifaceted: fear of catching plague, fear of starvation, fear of violence, fear of dying alone, and fear of watching loved ones die. Grief became a permanent background emotion as people lost family members, friends, neighbors, and the familiar world they had known. But grief was also a luxury that many people couldn't afford, because dwelling on losses might interfere with the focus needed for survival. Anger was common as people struggled with the apparent injustice of mass death and the collapse of everything they had believed about divine providence and social order. Some people became angry at God, others at their neighbors, still others at themselves for surviving when others had died. Hope became precious and fragile, flickering like a candle flame in a windstorm. People clung to small signs that things might improve a day without new plague cases. The discovery of hidden food supplies, news that other communities had survived. Loneliness was epidemic even among people who weren't physically alone, because the psychological isolation of constant fear and grief made genuine human connection difficult. People were surrounded by others, but felt utterly alone in their terror and despair. Numbness was a common psychological defense mechanism as people became emotionally overloaded by constant trauma. Many plague survivors described feeling like they were watching their lives from outside their bodies, disconnected from their own experiences by the sheer intensity of what they were enduring. Your physical health during the Black Death would have been compromised by malnutrition, stress, poor living conditions, and constant exposure to disease, even if you never caught plague yourself. The psychological trauma of living through mass death created physical symptoms that weakened people's immune systems and made them more susceptible to all kinds of illness. Sleep deprivation was common as people stayed awake worrying about survival, listening for sounds of danger, or caring for sick family members. Chronic exhaustion made people more vulnerable to disease and less capable of making good decisions about their safety. Malnutrition was widespread as food supplies became unreliable, and as people were forced to eat whatever they could find rather than maintaining balanced diets. Vitamin deficiencies caused scurvy, night blindness, and other conditions that further compromised people's health. Stress-related physical symptoms included headaches, digestive problems, muscle tension, and skin conditions that developed in response to constant psychological pressure. People's bodies were literally breaking down under the strain of trying to survive in impossible circumstances. Injuries became more dangerous when medical care was unavailable and when people's immune systems were already compromised. A simple cut that would have healed quickly in normal times might become infected and life-threatening during the plague years. Exercise and physical fitness declined as people spent more time hiding indoors, had less food energy available for physical activity, and focused their physical efforts on survival tasks rather than maintaining their strength and health. And finally, even if you somehow managed to survive all of this, the disease, the starvation, the violence, the psychological trauma, the collapse of civilization, you'd emerge into a world that was fundamentally different from the one you'd known before. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed an entire way of life. The survivors who crawled out of the wreckage of medieval Europe were changed forever by their experiences. They had seen things that no human beings should have to see. They had made choices that no one should have to make. They had learned lessons about human nature, divine justice, and the fragility of civilization that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. So no, you wouldn't have survived as a peasant during the Black Death. You wouldn't have survived as anything during the Black Death, because survival wasn't really about skill or preparation or intelligence. It was about luck, pure and simple. And most people, no matter how smart or strong or well prepared they were, simply ran out of luck. The Black Death was nature's reminder that human civilization, for all its sophistication and apparent permanence, is actually a thin veneer over chaos. It can be swept away in a matter of months by something as simple as bacteria carried by fleas on rats. All our plans, our social structures, our beliefs about justice and meaning and the future can disappear faster than we can comprehend. That's why you wouldn't have survived. Not because you're weak or unprepared, but because survival in that situation was mostly random chance, and the odds were overwhelmingly against everyone. The Black Death was humanity's encounter with forces so much larger than individual human agency that personal survival strategies became almost irrelevant. But perhaps that's the most important lesson, that we should appreciate the stable, peaceful, medically advanced world we live in now, because history shows us just how quickly and completely it could all disappear. The peasants of 14th century Europe thought their world was permanent too, right up until the moment it ended. So the next time you complain about why being slow or your coffee being cold, remember that you're living in a miraculous time when most people don't die horribly of infectious diseases, when food is abundant and safe, when clean water comes out of taps, and when the biggest threats to your daily survival are traffic accidents and bad weather. The Black Death was a reminder that none of these things are guaranteed, and that the line between civilization and chaos is much thinner than we'd like to believe. You wouldn't have survived as a peasant during the Black Death, but fortunately, you don't have to. That's a luxury that would have been incomprehensible to the people who lived through humanity's darkest hour, and it's one we should never take for granted.